This is a copy of some of the notes and the discussion from the Bible study on the greatest of them all. Before listening to this, you should read Mark chapter 12, verses 28 to 33, and 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 31 to chapter 13, verse 7. There's a link below the video to those. Every decade there is a film that sweeps all the awards. It wins every Oscar and every BAFTA. The critics and the audience both agree this year this is the greatest of them all. And sometimes it's difficult to put into words what makes that thing great. You just know it on an experiential level. You just know after watching something like Ben-Hur or Titanic or Schindler's List or The King's Speech, you know that you've just experienced something great. Now, when it comes to the biblical Oscars, love wins in every category. Love is described as the greatest commandment. It's regarded as the greatest gift. It's described as the number one fruit of the Spirit. It's the character trait that Paul ranks above all the others. And we know this not just from theoretically. We know that when we experience love, when someone shows great kindness to us, we appreciate just how great love is. And yet, in these two passages that you just read from, we find the Pharisees debating if love was that great. And we find that the Corinthians were not seeking to show love to one another. Why? Why is the greatest gift avoided? Well, imagine you are a Corinthian reading chapter 13. You're part of a church where the gift of prophecy wins you Tom Hanks fame. You've just won a standing ovation for donating your Oscar to help orphaned pandas. You've fathomed all mysteries. You actually understand the plot to 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then you read this. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. I am nothing. I gain nothing. That's like a politician spending all day kissing babies and then being told that there was no film in the camera. The Corinthians wanted to gain from using their gifts for others. But love is all about the gain of the other person, not ourselves. And yet, which is perhaps why we aren't automatically choosing spiritual gift number one, because love causes us to look away from ourselves and towards the other person. In that passage in Mark, that it's also replicated in the book of Matthew. And we read these words. One of them, an expert in the law, tested Jesus with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? In Jesus' day, the Pharisees were constantly debating which of God's commands were light, less important, and which were weighty, more important. The most important commands, well, they knew they had to keep them. The less weighty ones were less essential. But the question, which is the greatest commandment, is a bit like a mechanic at your MOT, asking which of your 4 tyres are most important to you. It's a bit like a husband asking, it's a bit like a husband to be asking their fiancée to underline the vows that she most wants him to keep. Which one do you want me to be most committed to? Loving you in sickness or in health? You know, these type of questions reveal a lack of commitment, a lack of sincerity. true sincerity, true commitment would mean that you wanted to be committed to them all. To love in sickness and in health. And to fix all 4 of that person's tyres. Whereas the Pharisees, their question revealed a lack of commitment. They did not want to obey all of God's command. And when Jesus gives his answer, he does not give one of the commands. Jesus, in fact, quotes Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy was the last book of the 5 books of Moses. And each of the first 4 books contains laws and instructions. Genesis includes the instruction about circumcision. Exodus included the 10 commandments, plus a few more. Leviticus includes laws about priests, Levites, and festivals. And Numbers contains a mix of all of these. Deuteronomy doesn't contain any new commandments. Rather, it's a sermon reflecting back. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses reflects back on the commandments that God has already given. And he says, these are the commandments. So he says, these are the commands, decrees, and laws your God directed me to teach you to observe. Not these that I am about to mention, but these that I have just mentioned. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. It wasn't a formal, chiseled in stone commandment. It was more a summary statement of all that had already been said. It was a summary of all the commandments as a whole. It's a bit like Eddie Howe, the Newcastle manager, giving commands to his Newcastle team. We're going to close down every pass that we lose immediately. We're going to try and score on the break. We're going to play a 4-4-2 formation. We're going to play maximum intensity in the first half to secure a lead. And then Eddie Howe at the end says, try your hardest to win. Try your hardest to win isn't a new 5th commandment. It's not a new tactic. It's rather a summary statement of all the other commands. If you try your hardest to win, then you are going to follow all of his other instructions as well. In much the same way, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. It wasn't a commandment. It's more a summary statement of all that had been said. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And this was the message the Pharisees needed to hear, for they had a pick-and-choose approach to the law. We read in Matthew 23 that Jesus said, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." The Pharisees were heavily committed to certain aspects of the law, but lightly committed to others, whereas Jesus called them to commitment to all. And we can see this in the difference between Deuteronomy 6 and Jesus' requotation in Mark 12. In Deuteronomy 6 it says, see if you can spot the difference by the way. In Deuteronomy 6 Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." Then Jesus requotes these words in Mark chapter 12. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." Jesus adds, all your mind. Now that could just be the Bible translators using two Greek words, heart and mind, to summarize the word heart. But it could just as well be Jesus correcting the Pharisees by adding an extra thing. The Pharisees were trying to get out of obeying God's commands, whereas Jesus was calling them to an even greater commitment to them. And so he didn't just tell them to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. He told them to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. In other words, God demands our all. And in love does demand our all, and yet notice that it's also the quietest of the gifts. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the first verse is very noisy. It speaks in hyperbole of people speaking in the tongues of men or of angels, something noisy that would surely attract a lot of attention. And it describes it as a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Noise, noise, noise. And contrast that to the ingredients that make up love in verses 4 and 5. They're not noisy, they're quiet. Love is patient. Impatience can be heard, loud sighs, lots of tapping fingers. Whereas patient holds back showing frustration and holds back shouting out loud, I wish you would hurry up. Love does not boast. Now boasting is very noisy, loudly drawing attention to the thing that's going unnoticed, loudly drawing attention to ourselves, whereas humility is happy to stay quiet. Love is not proud. Proud people can be heard, criticizing others, making their opinion known, whereas humble people listen. They hold back from criticizing others, and they use their words sparingly. Love does not dishonor others. The slander of others can be heard on their social media in the noise of our conversations. But saying nothing requires us to stay quiet. Love is not self-seeking. When we seek our own interests, we make sure that our voice, our opinion, and our preferences get heard. Whereas selfless people listen to the needs of other people. Love is not easily angered. Anger involves loud sighs and raised voices, whereas self-control involves holding back your tongue. Love keeps no record of wrongs. If you keep a record of wrongs, you share it with others and remind the offender as much as possible. Whereas if you forgive, you are choosing never to mention the subject again. It's interesting, isn't it? All these actions that the Corinthians were doing would draw lots of attention to themselves, whereas God values little acts of kindness that might go unnoticed, but they're just as valuable to God and to the other person who is being helped. And so, Paul and Jesus describe the greatest of all them all as love. Now, this seems like a very high bar that Paul and Jesus are setting. To love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself. Gosh, the bar is really high. It might seem like a challenge, a burden on our backs to show such a degree of love. And yet the Apostle John didn't share this same perspective. He said in his book, 1 John, this is love for God, to keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. How could John describe the God's commands as not burdensome? Well, this is why he said it. For this is the love of God, to keep his commands, and his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. Now, John was the apostle most familiar with the Bible's teaching about the new birth. He recognized that when a person becomes a believer, God's Spirit makes them a new person, planting in them new desires, including the new desire to love God and the new desire to love others and to make that the primary focus of one's life. And all the laws and the prophets hang on these two commands. That is what Jesus said. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Now the law pointed to the command to love God and to love others, whereas the prophets pointed to the day when God's Spirit would plant such desires in God's people's hearts. So that the commands aren't just an external thing that God calls us to obey, but the commands are an internal thing which we want to obey. As God said through the prophet Jeremiah, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after this time, declares the Lord. I'll put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." God puts the desire to love Him and love others within our hearts. That doesn't necessarily mean that loving God and others is automatic or a walk in the park. It can be a great challenge. So how do we increase our love for God and our love for others? Well, Apostle John also wrote, "We love because He first loved us." Because we know of God's love for us, we desire to love Him back. You could put it like this. It's a bit like a priest telling a husband that he might now kiss the bride. The desire to kiss the bride came before the commandment. Therefore, kissing the bride is not a burden. If the priest then tells the wife, "You may now throw your shoe at your husband," well, on her wedding day, she's not going to do that because that's not her desire. 3 months in the future, that might be what she wants to do. But that's not her desire. When the desire comes before the command is obeyed. When the command comes before the desire, the command will not be obeyed. And the way to increase our love for God is to remember His love for us. Remember, that's what John described himself as. Remember, John did not describe himself as the disciple that Jesus asked. John described himself as the disciple Jesus loved. You know, when he heard Jesus teaching to do this, that, or the other, he didn't think, "Oh, well, I'm the disciple that Jesus asked to do all these things." No, he knew that this was the voice of the one who loved him. And therefore he wanted to love God and love others in response to God's first love for him.